Recording will start soon. Okay, I think I'm recording now. Let me begin. And actually, let me do this. 1 second. Let me split it so I can still see the chat window while I'm talking to you. Can you guys still see? You can see the screen I'm presenting and everything. You see the notes page and stuff there. Okay, good. So follow along. Get yourself a nice little quiz grade by taking some good notes here that you can use on your quiz on Monday. All right. So the Protestant Reformation. First of all, what I think is useful about studying this, why it's important, right? Because it's sort of it's this religious development, but it does a lot of other things. You know, whether you're in any of those religions or not, that are really important historically. One, they talk about this in the crash course video. Embedded in that phrase, Protestant Reformation, is the words protest, right, and reform, right? That this was a protest for reforms. In this case, within a religion, within the Catholic Church or the Christian religion. But this is, you know, a sign of this stuff going on throughout history, right? We can say that we recently have seen a lot of like sort of protests and things like that for reform in our country, right? And so this is something that's happening 500 years ago, where similarly people are engaged in their society and they're protesting for reforms to things that they see as corrupt or, you know, not useful to them and so on. This is a religious reformation. Another reason I think this is sort of important is that if you are Christian and you're not Catholic, like, well, then this is kind of an important event in the history of, you know, whatever you believe, right? This is where a lot of the other variations of Christianity, Baptist, Methodist, Mormon, even maybe like some people consider sort of a Protestant denomination, they all kind of come out of this, right, over the next couple centuries. I put on there, this leads to a plurality of views. Sort of before the Protestant Reformation in Europe, you had really just kind of one interpretation of Christianity. And it's after this that you get a lot. And then that sort of itself leads to things like religious toleration, right? Leads to people not just accepting different versions of Christianity, but people in Europe accepting different religions, you know, as totally acceptable, right? To live sort of side by side, to be neighbors with. Before that, though, the other thing is this leads to some of the worst wars in European history before we get to World War I, World War II. Some of these religious wars were the worst thing that had happened in Europe up to that point, all right? This also is like kind of one of the places where the printing press really becomes this very important thing and has this big impact on history, right? So those are some things, you know, whether you know are religious or not, that's not super really the important thing about this event. It's a good example of a lot of other things, right? Protest movements, the things that lead to religious toleration, but also how sometimes these differences in views can go the worst way, go to religious war, civil war. Okay, so what we can start with is that the people we're going to talk about are trying to reform the church. This church is the Catholic Church, okay? In the Middle Ages, it was not called the Catholic Church because it was the only thing there was, really, right? If you went to like Russia or Greece, there was the Orthodox Church, but all in Western Europe, everybody was Catholic. They were all the things. So they just called each other Christian. It wasn't the Catholic Church. So that was the dominant sort of religion in Western Europe. It unified everybody. But also in sort of keeping itself in that position, it involved a lot of suppressing of heresy, right? Heresy is anything that sort of goes against the teaching of the church, right? If you teach something different than the Catholic Church did, you might be branded a heretic. And they could do bad things to you. We'll look at some examples of some heretics here in a second. One of the other things that you should know that's going to be important to the rest of what we're talking about here is that in this church, the clergy, the priesthood, was elite, right? They had special training. They spoke Latin. The Bible was written in Latin in Western Europe. So the priests were really kind of the only people that could read the Bible, right? Unless you were very educated, which not very many people were. The priesthood were the people that mainly could read the Bible and interpret it for you, right? So if you were a peasant in some, German village or French village or something, you didn't really ever know. You didn't know what was in the Bible, right? It was what you heard at church. You'd never read that thing for yourself. When you went to church, they were speaking Latin. You didn't know what they were saying, right? It was like they were doing the mass, the Catholic mass, and you just sort of watched, right? And then did communion and went home. These priests lived different lives. They were celibate. They didn't get married, right? So they were not sort of among the ordinary people, I guess, in a sense. And it was through the church only that people interpreted the Bible, right? You had to kind of get that through your priest. Now, a lot of that stuff has changed today. Even in the Catholic Church, the priests are still celibate. They don't do the mass in Latin anymore. Everybody there knows how to read the Bible and is encouraged to, right? There's not just the priests giving you the interpretation of the Bible. And a lot of those changes come out of this Reformation, okay? But before the guy that we're going to talk about, Martin Luther, there are some other people that try to do this. One of those guys is an Englishman called John Wycliffe. If you anybody ever heard of the rap group The Fugees? Anybody ever heard of Wycliffe John? It's like a rapper kind of from when I was a kid, but that guy kind of takes his name from this guy, John Wycliffe, who does a lot of things. But the bare minimum that I want you to know is that in the 1300s, he makes a vernacular translation of the Bible. What that means is he translates the Bible into English, right? He translates into sort of the version of English that was used at that time so that normal people could read it, right? People that could read, but you didn't have to speak Latin to read his Bible. You could read it in English. Well, that was a big no-no, all right? He believed that you couldn't sort of trust the priesthood, that some of these guys might be manipulating what's in the Bible to benefit themselves, and that you should just be able to read the Bible for yourself and kind of like get to the heart of, whatever you think the truth is, right? On your own, using your own interpretation. He translates that Bible. He dies. Nobody knows that he really does that. He doesn't become famous necessarily in his lifetime for doing that. But after the fact, people find out, and they dig his bones up and burn them as a heretic. Okay, they dig him out of the cemetery that was like sacred ground, and they set his bones on fire as a heretic. Because what you do? You burn witches, you burn heretics. All right. Another guy is Jan Hus, who is alive kind of as John Wycliffe dies, and he believes a lot of John Wycliffe's ideas. He thinks you should translate the Bible into languages people could read. He also, if you watch some of the videos, he's also against the sale of indulgences. We'll talk about those in a second. But he thought, the church is doing a lot of corrupt things. We shouldn't have to rely on them to interpret the Bible. We should translate it into languages people could read. He gets executed for saying these things. He's burned alive. He's burned at the stake. And this kind of even starts some religious wars in Eastern Europe that we're not going to get into, but these crusades against these people. So this idea of sort of burning heretics, we could go back to Joan of Arc, who was, this general in one of the big wars in Europe, who said she was sort of being spoken to by God. She helps the French basically win this war against the English. When the English capture her, they set her on fire as being a heretic, right? Because she said she was talking to God and things like that, right? And they're like, she's a false prophet. They burn her for being a heretic. This was common, right? People got burned alive, got set on fire. If you did the things that Martin Luther or some of these Protestants are going to do, there was a real risk, is what I'm trying to show you here, right? There are examples of other people that tried this before and it didn't work out. Let's see. This is John Wycliffe's Bible, right? We can't read it. This is in Old Middle English, right? So it doesn't look like anything to us. It looks like another language. It basically is. But this is not Latin, right? This is one of the copies of what he wrote there. This is them burning Jan Hus, one of these medieval pictures of it, and some other stuff. Let's see. Okay. Dang it. So skipping ahead here. So let's see. Martin Luther is the next reformer, right? He comes around in the 1500s, and he is a German monk that lives in the Holy Roman Empire. And he basically kind of teaches at a Christian school, right? He teaches religion at a Christian school. And he also, like these guys that came before, is feeling like the church is corrupt. And one of the big things that he disagreed with was the sale of indulgences, okay? An indulgence was something that the church sold to help dead people, basically, right? If your relatives died before they could do confession or before they could like get blessed by a priest or something like that, the idea was that they wouldn't go straight to heaven. They might go to heaven eventually, but that before that they would go to this place called purgatory, which wasn't great. You were supposed to kind of suffer until your soul was pure, and then you could go to heaven. But you might be there for crazy amounts of time, right? 100,000 years or something. It's sort of like in the beliefs of the medieval person. And so the church would sell these indulgences. You could pay some money, like, my grandma died. She didn't go to confession before she died. I think she might be in purgatory. And this indulgence would cut some time off of how long she was going to be in purgatory, is what the Catholic Church said at this time. So Martin Luther disagreed with this, okay? And he writes this, what's called the 95 Thesis, okay? And it's basically what you see here. These are, the 41st, 42nd, and 43rd thesis. These are 95 arguments against selling indulgences and other things he thought were corrupt, okay? So that's what Martin Luther does, is he kind of has some things that he sees his church doing that he disagrees with, and he writes them all down in this big essay. The big thing is selling indulgences, and he nails that to the church door, the big cathedral door at the town that he teaches in, all right? That's 95 thesis, 95 arguments against indulgences and other things he thought the Catholic Church was doing wrong, right? He really disagreed with this idea that you could sort of buy your way into heaven, right? He didn't like that idea. He thought you gotta, don't you have to be a good person, believe in God? Don't you got to do something like that? This sounds like you could just drop a bunch of money in a chest, buy an indulgence, and you can, you get this get out of jail free card or something, right? So the Pope hears about this. His emperor hears about this, who's also like a good friend of the Pope and the church. And they call Martin Luther to this meeting that has a kind of a silly sounding name, the Diet of Worms or Worms. Worms is a city in Germany, and Diet is like a kind of meeting. All right. So this is the meeting or the Council of Worms, the meeting that happens in the city of Worms. Well, that happens in 1521, and the short version of that is that Luther ends up getting excommunicated from the church. He gets kicked out of the Catholic Church because what happens is the Holy Roman Emperor calls him there and wants to kind of find out what's going on. He asks Luther to kind of take back all the stuff he said. Hey, you wrote this essay. You've been speaking against the Catholic Church. That's kind of a big no-no, but I think he calls him like a drunken German monk. He's like, maybe you just made a mistake. Take it all back, and we won't have to set you on fire, right? Luther refuses. He says, I can't in good conscience go against this stuff. I believe it, and I'm not going to take any of it back, right? Very brave, because he could definitely get set on fire for this. But what the emperor does is he says, well, I invited you here. So, because you came, I'm not going to hurt you here. I'll give you safe passage. That's what he'd promised him, safe passage, to get him to show up at this meeting. So he's like, I'm going to give you a couple days to go back home. And then when you get home, it's on. We're going to come after you. We're going to arrest you. We're going to set you on fire. Right. And so that's what he does. He issues this Edict of Worms, right? This law of Worms that said Luther is an outlaw in the empire. If you see him, capture him. All right. And Luther leaves, right? He's like, all right, well, I'm going to get out of here while the getting's good. This is supposedly a quote from that meeting where he says, unless I am convinced by proofs from the scriptures, he says, anything that we did in Christianity you should find evidence for it in the Bible. So he says, unless I'm convinced by proofs from scriptures or by plain and clear reasons and arguments, I can and will not retract or take back what I said, for it is neither safe nor wise to do anything against conscience. Here I stand. I can do no other. God help me. Amen. All right. So while he hides, sort of hides, he is taken in by one of these princes of the Holy Roman Empire and sort of hidden in this castle to keep him safe from the emperor. And while he's there, there are other German princes and noblemen and lords and stuff like that hear about Luther's ideas, and we'll talk about how they're able to hear about him so quickly, and they start to join Luther. They start to think his ideas about how he wants to change the church from those 95 arguments he wrote, all these things he thought were wrong that he wanted to change, becomes very popular, all right? And so people start to join his movement. These German princes and lords, they took control of Catholic churches, and they turned them into churches that followed sort of Luther's teachings, right? That did the mass a little bit different, that let priests get married, let monks get married, and things like that, right? Changed a lot of the structure of stuff that Martin Luther thought was sort of corrupt. One of the big things is, instead of the Pope and the Catholic Church running these churches, the government sort of oversaw them, right? So it was like the government was sort of in charge of the churches, not the church in charge of the government, which is sometimes how it went in the Middle Ages. But the big thing there is that this goes from a reform movement where Martin Luther didn't want to start a new religion. He didn't want to rebel. He didn't want any of that. He wanted to change the church. He wanted the Catholic Church to adopt some of these things that he was protesting about, right? But they don't. And this grows into this kind of revolution where there's going to be a lot of fighting as people sort of join Martin Luther's side. Any questions so far? Am I going too quick? Are you guys keeping up with some of this? Yeah. And try to summarize, right? You guys don't need to get everything word for word, but try to summarize as much as you can the big ideas. The big idea here is that Luther gets excommunicated. He gets kicked out of the church. He's made an outlaw. And while he's an outlaw, he's sort of like in hiding in one of these castles of the people that supports him. And, he's writing a lot of other stuff and sending this out to friends that are, we'll talk about the printing press, that are making lots of copies of it and spreading it around. And Luther's movement is growing. It's growing very quickly. Okay, so the printing press. I have a link here. It's difficult for me to show it to you, but you guys are able to open this up after. If you click on that link for the Gutenberg press, if you're able to look at this later, I have a little video in there of what this printing press actually looked like, right? But the Gutenberg press was invented, they think, around 1440 by this German guy, Johannes Gutenberg, who was probably influenced by a way earlier invention in China, right? China was printing stuff up in the year 800 or earlier. So they were, throughout most of world history, China was had all the best technology way before anybody. Johannes Gutenberg invents the printing press in Europe. The thing that was different about it is that it used movable type. So let me kind of show you some pictures here. These, okay, if you see all these little things in these little boxes, these all have letters on them, right? So you could pull out of these a letter G, a letter E, a letter T, and you could spell get, right? And you could sort of arrange and write whatever you wanted with this movable type. You could move it around. Before this, people had to carve basically stamps, right? Everything you wanted to copy, you had to carve it out of wood as one big stamp, and you could just kind of stamp that thing, but you could only, do one page. You'd have to make a bunch of these big giant stamps. And that took almost as long as hand copying the book, right? So this lets you really quickly sort of change the words you had on a page by moving all those letters around, okay? And then they would kind of put it into this sort of press. It's called a printing press, right? You have all the thing in there. They'd slather it with ink, and you'd use this lever to kind of press the stamp down, and you could put out tons of pages of whatever it was you were trying to print. Well, the first thing they actually print, some of the first things printed on this printing press in Germany were indulgences, right? Were indulgences for the Catholic Church to sell to people. One of the later things to get printed is called the Gutenberg Bible, all right? And that is a printed copy of the Bible, which you see here. And they kind of show you some of that in the video if you watch it. So I would know that. The Gutenberg Press, 1440, invented by this guy, Johannes Gutenberg, or we should say maybe reinvented because it existed earlier in China. What was different or unique about it is it used movable type and this kind of wine press. If you watch the video, you'll know what I mean by a wine press, to stamp these words onto a page. And the first things they printed were indulgences, but soon after they make a copy of the Bible known as the Gutenberg Bible, which is here. This is one of the original versions of it. that is like the printed version of the Bible. Okay, and so before long, they're copying this Bible into the German language, and it's spread all over, and people could do what Martin Luther was saying. They could read the Bible for themselves. Also, all the little essays and things like that that Martin Luther was writing while he was in hiding, they're making copies of those, and they're sending it all out, right? It used to be that when a guy like John Wycliffe or John Huss wrote or spoke against the church, you could set that guy on fire, and his ideas sort of died with him. Now, even if they got Martin Luther and they killed him, there's 40,000 copies of his essay floating around, right? Like now it's like an infection, right? It's like an intellectual infection. It's like these ideas could get out there. And even if you killed Martin Luther, because of the printing press, his ideas are out there, right? And people could find that paper hidden somewhere. They could keep it hidden in their house, and they could continue to share and spread those ideas. This is a powerful invention, right? By the year 1500, just 60 years after it's invented, there's 1,000 of these printing presses in Europe. They've copied over 40,000 different books, but hundreds of thousands of copies of those. Half of them are religious things like the Bible or essays about religion like Martin Luther wrote. And because of this, because it was so much easier to get your hands on books, they weren't these rare handwritten things anymore, literacy begins to increase, right? It's with the printing press and the Protestant Reformation that literacy really begins to grow. Okay, so that's kind of the background. Okay, that's the stuff that maybe you got out of the videos. The stuff I want to finish up with here are the wars that come out of this. The first war that starts is known as the Peasant Revolt, okay, the German Peasants' Revolt. In 1525, in the Holy Roman Empire, what's basically Germany, these peasants rise up all across the country in rebellion, okay? And the nature of this rebellion was these guys were inspired by Luther and the reformers that were questioning the establishment, right? That were going against the traditions of how things had always been done and saying, we should reinterpret all this stuff, right? So they're inspired by Luther, and they say that. They say, we've been doing what Martin Luther said. One of the things they were doing was reading the Bible for themselves. And these guys come away with some kind of, we would say like socialist, sort of communist ideas about what's in the Bible, right? They read Jesus's message, these German peasants, and they thought, doesn't sound like Jesus wanted us to be poor. Doesn't sound like he wanted us to be like serfs. In fact, Jesus kind of sounds like a poor man in the Bible and not like a rich nobleman or something, right? And they're like looking at this, and they have all these ideas about getting rid of private property, about sharing everything, about redistributing the wealth of the lords and the kings and stuff. And this freaks the kings and the lords out and stuff, all right? So they revolt against their lords. They call on Luther to help them. They write letters to Martin Luther. Hey, like, we're kind of doing what you said. Like, will you support us, right? Will you say that you support what we're doing? And maybe, the king, the prince, they'll give us some of the stuff we're asking for. Have us stop being serfs and things like that. Luther didn't like them. He disagreed. He thought that things needed to be peaceful in the country in order so that the gospel could be spread. That's what he said anyway. And so he didn't side with them. He sided with the lords. He sided with the kings and stuff like that. In fact, he wrote a book or an essay, like a pamphlet, basically, called Against the Murderous Thieving Hordes of Peasants, right? He is very much against their movement. This is a quote from his book, right? You don't need to write the quote, but in there he says, let everyone who can smite, slay, and stab secretly or openly these peasants. Nothing can be more poisonous, hurtful, or devilish than a rebel. It is just as one must kill a mad dog. If you do not strike him, he will strike you. So he's seeing these kind of communist peasants running around Germany, trying to, recreate society and get rid of private property, do all this really radical stuff back then or today. And he's not with it, right? And he kind of condemns them. We got to keep in mind, he's like in the castle of a nobleman, right? That's where he's hiding. So he's not, however he felt about these guys, and he probably felt exactly as he said, he's not really in a position to support them anyway, right? He's hiding in the castle of a rich dude that's helping to keep him alive. So that's one. This peasant revolt starts. 200,000 or 300,000 of these peasants end up being slaughtered by the noblemen, right? They're outgunned, they're outmatched, they're outgeneraled, armored, right? They're a bunch of peasants with pitchforks and stuff. And they lose this war quickly and terribly, and a lot of them die. It's said to be the biggest peasant rebellion before the French Revolution, right? But it gets crushed. And I don't think Martin Luther supporting them would have made too much of a difference, really. All right, the guy that does that is this guy. It's Charles V, all right? Charles V was the Holy Roman Emperor. And also in Spain, he was called Charles I, and he was king of Spain too. He was against Luther. Charles V, or Charles I, if he was in Spain, was a super Catholic, and he wanted to keep his empire Catholic, and he wanted to get rid of this reform movement. But there's a few things that stop him from doing it, okay? And that lead to everything becoming a lot worse. But you should know the Holy Roman Emperor, the guy that Martin Luther is like dealing with throughout all this, is called Charles V. You can see him. Notice his strong chin here. It's real strong chin, this kind of underbite he's got. I want to talk to you about why doesn't this guy sort of crush Luther and just kind of, why doesn't he kill this guy early on? This is a side note. If you see that guy's chin, he's from a family called the Habsburgs. And the Habsburgs were one of the most powerful families in kind of European history, right? Up until, I mean, there's still probably some Habsburgs alive today, but they were super inbred as well. Like one of the things about European royalty is they wanted to keep their blood pure, right? And they would marry cousins, marry, uncles, aunts, whoever, so that you're kind of keeping yourself married to these really important people, and you're not marrying, outside the bloodline. But this whole family, if you see their jaw, like they were known for what's called as the Habsburg jaw, right? This kind of deformity, that a lot of them had because of all this inbreeding, all right? This Habsburg family. So this guy, Charles, he's from that family. And the reason he's not able to just squash Luther in this movement is they're fighting wars with France, a 20-year-long war they have with France. He's defending against the Ottoman Empire, who we just kind of talked about in our last module, right? Who's always trying to invade, that part of Europe. And a lot of these German princes that he would want to help him are on Luther's side, right? Like he's not in a good spot to sort of squash Luther in any way. So what he does is he signs a deal, all right? And this one you need to kind of have written down on there and know about, the Peace of Augsburg. He signs this deal, 1555, with all these princes that supported Luther and supported the Reform movement and stuff. And basically he says, okay, you can be whatever kind of Christian, right? If you were in Germany, instead of us having this war forever about, how you should do Christianity, you guys can do it however you want. What he says, though, is this in Latin, cuius regio, ius religio. You don't need to write that. But what it means is his realm, his religion. It means that the prince of whatever territory could pick if they were Protestant or if they were Catholic. And their people had to be that religion too. Okay. So this was actually kind of like a really chilled out response for the time. This was very progressive to give everybody this choice. The peasants aren't choosing. You don't get to choose if you want to be Lutheran or Catholic. Your prince does, your leader of the state or province that you live in, basically. And if you didn't like it, if he was Catholic and you wanted to be Protestant, you had to move. You had to move to one of the prince's areas that was Protestant instead. All right. But this basically said for a while, it's okay to be Protestant. We won't burn you as heretics. We're going to treat the Lutheran people, the Protestants, and the Catholics equally. All right. That's the Peace of Augsburg. Give you a second. Make sure you got that on there. Definitely want to know the Peace of Augsburg. 1555 makes it okay to be Protestant in the Holy Roman Empire, in what's Germany today. All right. But the way that it worked was the prince, the leader of some territory, he was going to pick the religion, and then you kind of had to follow that. And if you didn't like it, you had to move. But it gave people some kind of choice. And that was sort of the first time you really had a choice not to be Catholic in Western Europe. You still had to be Christian. All right. Jews, Muslims, they're still getting persecuted, right? Like you couldn't be a witch. You couldn't do like other things. You had to be Christian. But if you were Protestant or Catholic, you were going to be treated equally, is the idea. Okay. So moving on. All right. the movement spreads, okay? And it starts with just Luther's religion. It's called Lutheranism, right? Which is like basically like a diet version of Catholicism. It's very similar to Catholicism, but it cuts some stuff out. But if you went to a Lutheran church and you went to a Catholic church, they would look pretty similar. You'd have to really know what's going on to see some of the differences, all right? One of the big ones that even kind of grows bigger than Luther's movement was started by a guy called John Calvin, and is called Calvinism. And again, without getting into all the details, one of the big things that was different in Calvinism was he talked about this idea of predestination. He said that, you know, it didn't really matter if you did things like buy indulgences, if you helped the poor, if you, gave to charities and stuff like that. It's like your good works don't matter. Everything has sort of been predetermined, right? The Calvinists believed that when, according to them, when God created the earth, he knew who was going to heaven and who was going to hell before anybody was even born. It was predetermined, right? You had no say in the matter. You couldn't earn your way into heaven, right? You were sort of picked. They called these people the elect, right? And that's a big part of Calvinism. There's no free will. Everything's sort of predetermined. You're on this path, and God knows if you're going to heaven or hell. Whatever you do in life doesn't really matter. Like, obviously, only good people are going to be going to heaven, but God decided you were going to be good. Is kind of the idea, John Calvin's idea. You didn't really have any free will in the matter. Well, that was a big change from what the Catholic Church said, all right? One of the other guys that really changes and makes another new big version of Christianity is the King of England, Henry VIII, who's this guy here, all right? And at one point, the Catholic Church called him the defender of the faith, right? For like being a crusader, for defending Catholicism. But there comes a point where Henry wanted to get divorced from his wife, who he hadn't had any kids with. And he wanted to get a divorce from this wife, and he wanted to marry this other girl, Anne Boleyn, all right, who he'd fallen in love with. And the Pope wouldn't allow it, right? You're not really supposed to get a divorce in the Catholic Church. And so this is all happening at the time of the Reformation. And so Henry gets Parliament to approve England leaving the Catholic Church, right? They sort of decided we're going to leave the Catholic Church with all these German princes, and we're going to start our own Protestant religion, the Anglican Church or the English Church. Today it's called Anglicanism. It's still around, and the Queen of England is the head of the Anglican Church, right? King Henry was the head of this new church. And so he gave himself a divorce, and he married this woman, Anne Boleyn. And then he executes her. He kills her a couple of years later because of, again, he wants kids with somebody else. So not a great guy necessarily. And but he makes himself the head of this new church. All right, so you need to know Calvinism. Their big idea is predestination. There's sort of no free will. This group grows bigger than even Luther's movement. And in England, you get the English church, the Anglican Church, in part because the king, Henry, wanted to get a divorce, really. And he gives himself a divorce and goes on to execute several wives because they don't give him the children he wants. All right, one other movement that we could talk about are called the Anabaptists, all right? Their main idea, the big idea of Anabaptists was adult baptism, all right? They believed that, like, you shouldn't baptize a baby. Basically, is what their idea boils down to, that a baby doesn't know what's going on. It can't choose to get baptized or not get baptized. And it can't make a decision to join the church. So it doesn't really count, right? They thought you should raise a kid to be Christian, but don't baptize them until they're adults, because that's when you can really sort of like make a choice, right? That's when it means something, that where you're joining this church, right? I know all the things and I'm deciding to do this for myself. Well, that was a big deal, right? Like, again, this is something that it doesn't seem like a big deal to us maybe, but this was a radical reform. The idea that you were going to baptize somebody again as an adult instead of as a baby was a huge break from tradition. And even the other Protestants didn't like the Anabaptists because of that. Catholics and Protestants both, if they got their hands on the Anabaptists, would kill them because of some of their other ideas too, right? They considered all believers equal and all Christians basically to be their own priests. And they even sometimes let women be priests, which was another really big kind of radical change, okay? They did not respect any political or non-religious authority. They thought the Bible was the ultimate authority. And so this meant they wouldn't serve in any armies, for example, because the Bible says thou shalt not kill, right? So they're like, can't be a soldier, can't be like a cop or something. Like, I can't do any job that might have me kill somebody. So, even if my king tells me to go, join this army to go to war somewhere, they wouldn't do it, right? So they had enemies all over. They were seen as dangerous by Protestants and Catholics. And a lot of times they would execute these Anabaptists by drowning them. And it's kind of morbid, but they would call it giving them the third baptism, right? Because a lot of these guys had been baptized as babies when they were raised, Catholic. They got rebaptized as Anabaptists. And then when they drowned these people, when they got captured and, as heretics or whatever by the Catholics or the Protestants, they would drown them and call it the third baptism. So they get persecution from all sides, okay? And this gets us to where these wars really start getting out of hand. Okay, so let me try and wrap this up here. The last couple big major wars that go on is one of them is known as the French Wars of Religion. In France, you have French Calvinists, these French Protestants that were called Huguenots. Okay, but the Protestants in France, they were called Huguenots. They were a very small group. 7% of the population, okay, were Huguenots or Protestant. But that 7%, if this makes sense, that 7% was 50% of the nobility, right? So half of the really powerful people in France were Protestant, all right? And this leads to a war, okay, of this group called the Ultra-Catholics versus the Huguenots. And they fight for 30 years in France, this 30-year-long religious civil war. Like I said, these are some of the worst wars Europe has before World War I, where there's machine guns and bombs and all that, right? Without getting into all the details in this battle and that battle, the leader of the Protestants, the Huguenots, this guy Henry of Navarre, they call him Henry IV, becomes the king. They win this war in 1589. They win this war after 30 years of fighting, and the first thing this Protestant king does is he converts to Catholicism. Because remember, 93% of his country was still Catholic, okay? And he says something like, the throne or Paris is well worth a mass, right? He's like, being king of France, it's worth going to church. It's like, I'll be Catholic to keep everything together, all right? And he issues a law called the Edict of Nantes. I want you, if you write one thing about the French Wars of Religion, you should know who the Huguenots are, the French Protestants. And you should know that Henry, this Protestant leader who wins the war, converts to Catholicism because that's what the majority of his country was, and he's trying to unify everybody. But he puts out the Edict of Nantes that says French, in France, the official religion is Catholic, but the Huguenots, the Protestants, are free to worship however they want, right? They can do their religion. So it's almost like the Peace of Augsburg, right? Do whatever religion you want here, it's okay. And that kind of settles it for a little while, but not really, right? There's a couple little flare-ups after this. Almost done. Anything on this you guys still need? Am I going too quick? Okay. I don't have these pictures set up right. All right, the next one that we could mention is Philip II. He's the son of Charles V, right? Remember, Charles V was Charles I in Spain. His son is Philip II. Look at that jaw, right? This guy's a Habsburg, right? You can see it right in his face there. He was called in Spain the most Catholic king, right? So again, a super Catholic guy. He married the Catholic Queen of England, Queen Mary, and was going to sort of join these two places together, right? Return England to Catholicism after Henry VIII had sort of left the church, right? His daughter, Henry VIII's daughter, was Queen Mary. She was Catholic. She wanted to make England Catholic again, and Philip was going to help her make England Catholic again, right? Mary dies, and her sister Elizabeth ends up taking over. And Elizabeth is Protestant. She wants to keep doing what her dad did. So this ends up leading to a war. Philip II tries to invade England with this big Spanish armada. We're going to talk about, Spain, remember at this time too, 1492 is when they explore America. This is well after that, right? And Spain is super rich because of all the money they've gotten from America. We're going to talk about that in our next module. But he uses this big fleet they have to try and invade England. This armada, which is just, armada is like a big fleet, tries to invade, but they get their butts kicked by the English, actually. There's bad weather. The English have cannons that shoot a little farther. They were using kind of smaller boats that were a little bit more maneuverable. And they end up beating this Spanish armada really bad so that Spain couldn't invade them. And they stay Protestant, all right? But this is one big war that kind of comes out of this as well. The last one, where we'll wrap this up, is the 30 Years' War, okay? The 30 Years' War is, they say, the worst war in Europe before World War I, right? Of all these wars, this is the worst of them. And it's 30 years long. So the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, supposedly it ended the fight between Lutherans and Catholics in Germany or in the Holy Roman Empire. But it doesn't last, right? Tension remained between the two sides. Signing this piece of paper didn't really make up for the fact that people's families had been killed and stuff, in the Troubles before. So fighting starts again, 1618, 60-something years, 70 years after this treaty is signed. And it's going to end 30 years later. It's going to go from 1618 to 1648. And again, without getting into all the details, it's the most destructive war Europeans had experienced up to that point. People have guns, they have cannons. They're still using a lot of swords and spears and stuff like that. But it included a lot of countries: Denmark, Spain, France, Sweden, the Holy Roman Empire. It's like this European war. Almost every country in Europe is involved in it. And they're all picking sides, Catholic versus Protestant. And it's this mess, all right? The Holy Roman Empire ends up getting plundered and is destroyed. The Holy Roman Empire isn't a thing anymore after this war. 30% of the German population of that time was killed or starved during this war. I mean, 30% of the population is pretty nuts, right? Men, women, children, 30% of everybody in Germany is dead by the time this war is over. It ends with something called the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 that ends the war, and that treaty is also considered sort of the end of the Protestant Reformation. That's when, this final treaty sort of makes it okay to do your religion and ends this conflict, right? And that is the last kind of major Christian versus Christian religious conflict in Europe, all right? There is all kinds of art that comes out of this, though. I'll kind of show you some of that to close up. Before that, a couple stats on this war. Something like 8 million people died during the 30 Years' War. Now, it's over 30 years. They don't have machine guns and stuff like that, but just stabbing people to death and things like that. 8 million people died. This devastating war. Reduces, depending on where you're at, the population of certain areas by 25 or 40%. The male population of Germany is reduced by almost half because the men are the ones, in a lot of the battles and stuff. In places like Czechoslovakia, the population declines by like a third from war and disease and famine. And a lot of civilians are killed and attacked by cruel, kind of greedy mercenary soldiers trying to like rob houses and stuff and get money. So there's all kinds of artwork that comes out of this. You see these, like, there's mercenaries here sort of robbing these people on the road, right? Killing and robbing people, doing who knows what to the women here. You can see these gallows in the background where people have been hung, right? But this is all from that time period. People executing, I think these are Protestants executing some of the Catholics they got, right? At like as like a firing squad. I love this. So I take a minute to look at this painting with me. These are like, again, mercenaries like breaking into a house, robbing these people. And you've got, this guy over here, he's like attacking the mom or something. He's like going to stab this woman here. This guy's going to shoot this little kid. This baby's freaking out over here in the corner. This guy's, fighting with these women. He's got the guy on the ground. He's going to stab him. And you got this little kid over here. What's this kid doing? He's like chasing this duck, right? This little kid's like, he's going to take this moment to attack this swan over here. I love this painting where I'm like, your family's being murdered by these soldiers and this kid hates this goose or something, right? He's like, this is my moment, right? Today's the day the goose gets it. And he's going after that guy. I love it. But there's lots of this, right? It's going on throughout this war. It's one of the big things that they did, right? A bunch of Catholics, or I think in this case Protestants, sort of being hung from a tree and executed for heresy, right? So a bloody and vicious war that goes on for 30 years. That is the end of that, okay? So hopefully that helps tie together some of what we have been, or what you've been reading about, what you've been looking at this week in the videos you're watching and the stuff that you're reading. What you should turn into me is a set of those notes as we're done here, all right? And remember that it's worth a small quiz grade, okay? But you do a good job, it's 100% on a quiz grade, right? And that's a good way to sort of boost yourself if you're trying to catch back up in the 4 weeks or so we've got in the quarter here. You got any questions for me on anything that we covered there, or on what you're doing to kind of get credit for today? Yeah.